Hello, loyal listeners of Sci-fi Stories. Thank you so deeply for tuning in today. Our channel has recently been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without the budget to keep our operations running. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team and continue bringing these universes to life for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description and pinned comment. The magnetic containment field shattered with a deafening crack. Jagged shards of transparent alloy rained down as the beast broke free. It did not hesitate. Driven by a maddening hunger, the nightmare of the black holes locked its glowing, multifaceted eyes onto the only mind in the room, completely unprotected by a neural shield. It lunged, its claws tearing the very air apart, straight toward the fragile human, who simply sat and watched it come. The Ethelgard Topographical Engineering Academy hung suspended in the upper stratosphere of a turbulent gas giant. A solitary metal needle anchoring itself against atmospheric storms that could strip the flesh from bone. Inside Lecture Hall 9, the environment was equally suffocating, though for entirely different reasons. The room was a sprawling fortress of interlocking magnetic fields and reinforced heavy alloy bulkheads, designed specifically to contain the highly volatile gravitational anomalies the Academy frequently studied. The air was thick, heavily pressurized to accommodate the diverse respiratory needs of a dozen different alien species, leaving a metallic taste on the back of the tongue. In the farthest, darkest corner of the steeply tiered amphitheater sat Calvin Blankenship. He was an engineering intern, and more notably, the only human being within 3 parsecs. To the rest of the elite student body, humanity was little more than a cosmic joke. The towering, 6-limbed Kalins and the dense, silicon-scaled Virati possessed biological structures that rendered them apex predators on hostile worlds. They viewed humans as structurally fragile, neurologically primitive, and hopelessly prone to emotional collapse under even moderate pressure. A Kalin, seated 2 rows down, sneered, its heavy mandibles clicking in a rhythmic expression of undisguised disgust as it glanced back at Calvin. Calvin ignored it completely. He kept his hands folded loosely in his lap, his standard-issue uniform perfectly pressed, his breathing maintaining a slow, metronomic rhythm. The massive blast doors at the front of the hall groaned open on heavy hydraulic hinges, and the ambient temperature in the room plummeted almost instantly. The head instructor, a massive Virati draped in ceremonial academic robes, hovered into the room alongside a heavily shielded anti-gravity containment cell. The cell hummed with barely restrained power. "Attention!" the instructor barked, its deep voice vibrating fiercely through the universal translation matrix. "Today, we observe the extreme physiological limits of theoretical dark matter constructs. Do not lower your shields. Behold the null wraith." Inside the heavily reinforced transparent cage, a living nightmare thrashed violently against invisible magnetic walls. The null wraith was not an entirely physical entity. It was a jagged, shifting mass of crystalline energy and void black matter, harvested at a terrible cost from the event horizon of a dying singularity. It did not breathe oxygen. It did not consume organic tissue. It survived purely by feeding on the neurochemical radiation of abject terror and panic. The exact moment the cage settled onto the central podium, the entity let out a piercing, multi-tonal shriek that entirely bypassed the auditory canals and drove directly into the temporal lobes of every living thing in the room. A tidal wave of telepathic static washed over the amphitheater. The alien students immediately scrambled to activate their neural shields. Glowing collars and cranial implants flared to brilliant life, projecting thick, dampening fields around their heads. Yet, even with the advanced protection, several of the towering Kalins visibly trembled, their 4 eyes wide with primal, unfiltered dread. The sheer ambient pressure of the creature's projected hunger was utterly suffocating. Calvin Blankenship did not have a neural shield. Humanity had not yet developed the quantum technology necessary to compress such complex defenses into a wearable size. He sat completely exposed to the psychic onslaught. Yet, he did not flinch. He simply crossed one leg over the other. His pulse remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. His pale gray eyes tracked the erratic, violent movements of the null wraith, not with terror, but with the cold, calculating scrutiny of a mechanic inspecting a malfunctioning fusion engine. He watched the precise way the creature's crystalline ridges flared an angry violet whenever it struck the magnetic boundary. He analyzed the exact frequency of its telepathic output, mapping its behavior in his mind. The null wraith sensed the massive buffet of emotions in the room. It fed aggressively on the leaking anxiety of the shielded aliens, growing visibly larger, its dark matter core expanding with ravenous fury. It slammed its heavy, jagged appendages against the transparent alloy of the cage in a rapid succession of brutal strikes. The containment unit groaned audibly under the relentless physical and psychic assault. "Observe the creature's desperation," the instructor continued smoothly, entirely oblivious to the warning lights that had just begun flashing on the podium diagnostic console. "Its resonance frequency is attempting to synchronize with our localized fear emissions to break the dampeners." Calvin tilted his head slightly. His eyes zeroed in on the primary magnetic core located beneath the heavy cage. The blue light of the quantum stabilizer was flickering erratically. The creature was not just thrashing randomly in blind rage. Its telepathic shrieks were emitting a highly specific vibrational frequency, perfectly matching the resonant pitch of the magnetic field generator. It was intentionally overloading the system. Calvin uncrossed his legs and leaned forward by a fraction of an inch. The stabilizer light turned a solid, angry red. The catastrophic overload happened in less than 1 second. The magnetic core whined, producing a sound like tearing starship hull metal, and violently detonated. The heavy safety latches blew outward in a blinding shower of electrical sparks. The reinforced transparent alloy, suddenly deprived of its magnetic structural tension, shattered outward like a bomb made of jagged glass. Pandemonium erupted instantly. The heavy instructor was thrown backward by the concussive wave, slamming into the chalkboard display. The alien students shrieked, their composure shattering as they trampled over one another in a desperate bid to reach the sealed emergency exits. Freed from its prison, the null wraith expanded massively, its crystalline jaws opening to reveal a terrifying void of absolute darkness. It hovered in the air for a single, terrifying heartbeat, tasting the chaotic buffet of panicked minds in the room. It swept its gaze past the shielded Kalins and the terrified Verati. Then, it found the anomaly. It locked its glowing, multifaceted eyes onto the one mind in the room that was completely naked, completely unshielded, and radiating absolutely zero fear, driven by a maddening, impossible hunger. The beast shifted its entire mass and charged. It moved with a speed that literally tore the air apart, creating a localized sonic boom that rattled the heavy bulkheads, hurtling straight toward Calvin Blankenship. Time seemed to fracture. The lecture hall devolved into an absolute slaughterhouse of panic, the air instantly thick with the pheromones of unfiltered terror. Heavy footfalls thundered against the tiered flooring as the hulking Kalins and Verati, beings widely considered the apex predators of their respective star systems, trampled one another in a blind, pathetic stampede for the heavy bulkhead doors. Desks were violently overturned, their magnetic locks snapping under the sheer force of massive bodies crushing against them. At the front of the room, the head instructor desperately fumbled with the localized defense grid. "Activate countermeasures," he roared, his voice cracking with unprecedented terror. He slammed his heavy, scaled fists onto the primary weapons console, frantically attempting to bring the automated laser turrets online. But the targeting systems whirred uselessly in their housings. The unleashed entity was simply a blur of violent energy and dark matter, moving entirely too fast for the optical sensors to establish a lock. The creature bridged the vast distance of the amphitheater in a fraction of a second. To the fleeing aliens, it was a streak of localized death. But to Calvin Blankenship, the chaotic universe seemed to stretch and thin, every passing microsecond rendering itself in hyperclarity. He watched the beast crest the final row of desks, its massive, jagged jaws snapping open. The void inside its maw expanded, preparing to unleash a concentrated telepathic shockwave designed to violently rupture the neural pathways of anything caught in its path. Calvin did not flinch. He did not brace for impact. He did not even blink. While the alien scholars around him spun into a frantic centrifuge of noise and terror, he remained the absolute dead center of the storm, as the creature bore down on him, bringing with it the sharp scent of ozone and burning atmosphere. Calvin simply raised his gaze. He looked directly into the swirling vortex of its multifaceted energy eyes, meeting a shifting constellation of predatory hunger. He offered no fear to feed upon. He offered no defensive mental barriers to shatter. He offered only an endless, unyielding expanse of absolute quiet. The devastating psychic roar died in the creature's throat before it could even cross the threshold of its jaws. The sudden cessation of momentum was violently abrupt. The entity threw its full weight backward, its jagged claws biting deep into the reinforced metal flooring. Sparks erupted in brilliant, arching fountains of white and gold as it skidded wildly out of control. The agonizing shriek of torn metal drowned out the screams of the fleeing students. Driven by raw inertia, the beast slid forward, carrying its monstrous mass right up to the edge of Calvin's row. It came to a grinding, shuddering halt. The razor-sharp edge of its primary crystalline mandible rested exactly 3 inches from the polished toe of Calvin's standard-issue boot. For a long, agonizing moment, neither the human nor the nightmare moved. Then, the violent, blood-red luminescence radiating from the core of the entity began to stutter. The aggressive crimson faded, washing out into a rapidly pulsing purple, before finally settling into a soft, bioluminescent blue. The jagged, hostile edges of its dark matter form smoothed out. The towering monstrosity began to tremble violently. It shrank back on its haunches, tucking its terrifying appendages tightly against its core. A sound escaped its throat, but it was no longer a telepathic shriek designed to shatter minds. It was a low, vibrational whimper, thick with profound confusion and overwhelming disorientation. The beast, which only moments ago had been ready to devour the terror of an entire room, now sought only refuge. Slowly, hesitantly, it lowered its heavy, rugged head. It pressed its crystalline snout flush against the cold metal floor, sliding it forward until it gently bumped against Calvin's ankle. It curled its massive body inward, folding into a tight, shimmering sphere of blue light at the human's feet. It looked less like an apex predator from the edge of a dying star, and more like a lost, terrified child desperately clinging to the only safe harbor it had ever known. It had completely surrendered. The frantic stampede near the exits abruptly ceased. The instructor, still clutching the weapons console, froze perfectly still. The entire amphitheater plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the soft, rhythmic humming of the creature's blue core. Everyone stared, paralyzed by an impossibility that defied every known law of biological science. Calvin looked down at the lethal mass of dark matter resting heavily against his leg. He let out a long, quiet sigh. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out his bare hand and gently patted the jagged, crystalline shell of the deadliest entity in the known galaxy. The heavy blast doors of Lecture Hall 9 were violently breached. A fully armed tactical response squad of Kalan enforcers flooded the amphitheater, their heavy plasma rifles humming with lethal charge. They aimed directly at the glowing blue mass curled beside the human. Before a single trigger could be pulled, Calvin smoothly raised his right hand. The gesture was simple, minimal, yet it carried an undeniable weight of absolute authority. The Kalen captain hesitated, his scaled finger resting dangerously close to the firing mechanism. The Null Wraith immediately sensed the aggressive, hostile intent radiating from the enforcers. Its soothing blue core instantly flared to an angry, violent violet. It unleashed a low, bone-rattling growl that vibrated fiercely through the reinforced metal decking, promising absolute annihilation to anyone who dared to take another step forward. The tactical squad instinctively stepped back, their heavy weapons trembling in their grips. Yet, when Calvin slowly lowered his hand and let his bare fingers brush gently against the creature's jagged, crystalline crest, the violent, violet hue immediately subsided back into a docile, rhythmic blue. It tucked its monstrous head beneath its heavy appendages, hiding from the loud, chaotic minds of the terrified guards, finding profound solace only in the shadow of the fragile human. Within 20 minutes, the Academy administration had Calvin sealed inside a high-security neurological quarantine unit, deep within the specialized medical wing of Ethelgard. He sat strapped into a cold diagnostic chair, surrounded by a sterile array of sensory deprivation fields and hovering medical drones. On the other side of a thick, one-way observation glass, a team of top-tier alien neurospecialists stared intently at a highly detailed holographic projection of Calvin's brain. "Oh, scan the subject for localized neural link transceivers," ordered Dr. Vale, a senior physician whose elongated cranium housed a highly advanced analytical cortex. "Check his cerebral cortex for subdermal frequency emitters. Run a full diagnostic on the brainstem for organic parasitic control agents. He must be projecting some form of artificial calming wave to manipulate a dark matter entity of that magnitude." The automated medical drones hummed sharply as they bathed Calvin in penetrating quantum resonance beams. The massive holographic model of his brain spun and shifted in the air, highlighting various lobes in different glowing spectrums. "Negative on all counts, Doctor," a technician replied, rapidly adjusting the resolution matrix on his console. "There are no cybernetic implants. There are no parasitic entities. His neural structure is entirely organic. It is completely human." Dr. Vale leaned much closer to the glowing projection, his 4 ocular nodes narrowing in intense disbelief. "That is scientifically impossible. Look closely at his amygdala. Look at the entire limbic system. The neural pathways responsible for processing terror, panic, and acute distress are completely dormant. They are not merely suppressed by chemical agents. They have been biologically pruned at the cellular level. He is registering absolute zero on the emotional radiation scale. His mind is an absolute void." Before the medical team could debate this impossible biological anomaly further, the heavy pneumatic door to the observation deck slid open with a sharp hiss. Professor Eris Thorne, a deeply wrinkled and universally respected archivist of the Interstellar Alliance, stepped heavily into the dimly lit room. He held a decrypted datapad in his trembling, frail hands. "You will not find an artificial emitter, Dr. Vale," Thorne rasped, his voice heavy with a complex mixture of cold dread and profound awe. "I just bypassed the highest tier of military encryption on this boy's personnel file. Blankenship is not merely an engineering intern on a student exchange." Thorne stepped forward and activated the primary display screen, forcefully overriding the medical holograms. A spinning, fragmented, and horrifyingly silent video file of a colossal orbital structure appeared. It was heavily damaged, its massive spatial rings shattered and actively being swallowed by a localized gravitational distortion. 7 years ago," Thorne continued, the heavy weight of forgotten history resonating in his words. "The Horizon space gate suffered a catastrophic dark energy manifold collapse. The ensuing spatial implosion swallowed the entire research facility. Calvin Blankenship was a young adolescent apprentice stationed on that sector. He is the sole survivor of the tragedy. A collective, sharp gasp echoed through the crowded observation deck. The horizon collapse was a legendary, terrifying tragedy that had scarred the collective consciousness of the galaxy. He did not merely survive the initial kinetic blast. Thorne pressed on, zooming in on a tiny, almost invisible life pod drifting aimlessly on the screen. The quantum implosion cast his escape pod completely outside of our physical reality. It threw him directly into the theoretical region known as dead space-time. The alien doctors froze in absolute horror. Dead space-time was a theoretical expanse trapped entirely between quantum realms. It was a dimension defined purely by the absolute absence of physical matter. There was no light. There was no sound. There was no gravitational pull, no thermal radiation, and absolutely zero sensory stimuli. It was a terrifying void so absolute that even advanced artificial intelligences, when theoretically subjected to it for mere hours, suffered permanent cascading structural failures. He drifted alone in that absolute, crushing nothingness for 400 days, Thorne whispered, letting the sheer magnitude of the number settle over the room. 400 days with absolutely nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat for company. A standard organic mind would shatter into violent, irreparable psychosis within a single week. But his brain did not shatter. To survive the infinite, deafening silence of the ultimate void, his physical mind forcibly adapted. Thorne pointed a trembling finger back to the towering hologram of Calvin's brain. It aggressively rewired its own internal architecture. It permanently shut down the psychological centers of panic, because experiencing panic in the void burns precious metabolic energy and inevitably leads to madness. He literally excised his own biological capacity for fear. He constructed an impenetrable internal fortress of pure, undisturbed silence. He is a walking, breathing, emotional black hole. Dr. Vale stared through the thick glass at the human sitting incredibly calmly in the isolation chamber. The scattered pieces of the impossible puzzle rapidly snapped into a chilling, flawlessly logical configuration. The null wraith, Vile muttered, the profound realization dawning with terrifying clarity. It feeds aggressively on fear because it is exquisitely, painfully sensitive to emotional radiation. To a creature born on the violent edge of a dying star, our populated universe is a deafening, agonizing cacophony of psychic noise. The fear, the anger, the constant, chaotic buzzing of billions of sentient thoughts, it actively tortures the entity. Vile pressed a trembling hand against the cold observation glass, looking at Calvin with newfound reverence. But Blankenship projects absolutely nothing. His mind is completely, utterly empty. To the null wraith, this fragile human is not prey. Amidst the unbearable, screaming psychic noise of the entire cosmos, Calvin Blankenship is the only quiet place it has ever found. He is not a master. He is an oasis. The Ethelgard administration, driven by standard containment protocols, made the catastrophic error of attempting to separate them. They transported the creature into a deep subterranean isolation vault, sealing it behind 3 consecutive layers of dense titanium alloy. Deprived of the profound, crushing silence of Calvin's mind, the null wraith was instantly plunged back into the agonizing, deafening psychic noise of the station. It immediately refused to consume any synthetic energy sources. Within 48 hours, starvation and sensory overload drove the entity completely feral. Its core shifted into a blinding, hyper-violent crimson. It tore through the first alloy wall, as if it were made of fragile parchment. It shattered the second barricade with a concentrated telepathic shockwave, and was actively melting through the final containment seal when the heavily armed security forces prepared to authorize a localized plasma strike. Then, A distinct acoustic signature echoed down the ruined corridor. It was the slow, rhythmic, unhurried sound of standard-issue human boots. Calvin walked calmly through the smoke and twisted metal. The beast froze. The violent crimson light instantly dimmed to a soft, flickering blue at the mere acoustic signature of his approach. The Supreme Council of the Academy, recognizing their complete inability to contain the threat by conventional means, drafted an unprecedented emergency directive. They legally tethered the apex entity to the human intern. From that solar cycle onward, the null wraith became Calvin's permanent, physical shadow. It stalked silently, always hovering just behind his right shoulder, its jagged crystalline edges shifting smoothly to match his walking pace. The sheer presence of the creature fundamentally altered the intricate social ecosystem of Ethelgard. The towering Kalins and the dense, silicon-scaled Verati, the very same elite scholars who just weeks prior had openly sneered at the fragile human, now flattened their massive bodies against the cold corridor bulkheads whenever he passed. They averted their multiple eyes. The alien scholars had finally realized a deeply chilling truth. The boundary, separating a physically weak species from a survivor who had waded through the absolute abyss of the universe, could never be measured by muscle mass or armored scales. A profoundly eerie, silent symbiosis blossomed between the boy and the nightmare. Calvin never spoke verbal commands to the creature. Instead, he developed an intricate, noiseless language built entirely on kinetic taps and subtle micro-gestures. 2 gentle taps of his index finger against his thigh commanded the beast to compress its dark matter core, drastically reducing its ambient thermal radiation so they could safely pass through crowded cafeterias. A slow, downward sweep of his palm ordered it to halt completely. A single twitch of his wrist commanded it to stand down. It was a secret, silent vocabulary that only the 2 of them understood, born from the shared isolation of the void. The absolute breaking point of the Academy's fragile new hierarchy occurred during a standard zero-gravity transit drill in the main hangar bay. A deeply arrogant Kalin noble, secretly humiliated by his own lingering, inescapable terror of the human, decided to violently test the myth. Waiting until Calvin was facing a maintenance console, the Kalin grabbed a jagged magnetized plasma spike and hurled it directly at the back of the human's neck with lethal, bone-shattering force. The null wraith did not roar. It did not even physically lunge. It merely shifted its multifaceted gaze. The heavy metal spike froze instantly in midair, caught securely in a localized, crushing gravitational anomaly generated effortlessly by the beast. The creature's soothing blue core flared into a blinding, lethal violet. It coiled its massive, shifting body, preparing to launch across the hangar and violently unmake the Kalin down to its molecular foundation. Before the creature could unleash its fury, Calvin simply snapped his fingers one single time. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent, terrified hangar. The beast froze mid-strike. It looked down at the human, then back at the trembling Kalin, and slowly lowered its jagged, terrifying head. It released the gravitational hold, letting the heavy metal spike clatter harmlessly to the deck plating. The creature tucked itself back behind Calvin's shoulder, fully submissive. It was a display of absolute, godlike restraint that terrified the onlookers far more than the violence would have. The story of the hangar incident spread like a digital contagion through the station's encrypted data streams. Calvin Blankenship was no longer just an anonymous engineering intern from a backwater planet. Whispered voices in the dark corridors dubbed him the Shadow Bearer. The detailed accounts of a fragile organic mind maintaining total, effortless dominion over an apocalyptic anomaly did not stay confined within the thick walls of Ethelgard. The encrypted security reports rippled rapidly outward across the galaxy, eventually crossing the pristine desks of the highest-ranking military strategists within the Interstellar Alliance High Command. The ambition of the Interstellar Alliance High Command was matched only by their breathtaking arrogance. Less than 72 hours after the hangar incident, a heavily armored diplomatic cruiser docked with Ethelgard. From it emerged Envoy Tyrus, a high-ranking military tactician whose pristine uniform was burdened with dozens of commendations. Tyrus did not see a survivor and a cosmic anomaly. He saw the ultimate biological weapon, and he demanded an immediate, extreme stress test to quantify its combat viability. Calvin explicitly refused. He warned the envoy, maintaining his perfectly level tone, that the equilibrium they shared was not a military asset to be exploited. But his protests were entirely disregarded by the command structure. Under the strict threat of immediate court-martial and permanent exile into the deep colonies, a squad of fully armed Alliance operatives escorted Calvin and the Null Wraith down into the heavily shielded primary energy core of the station. The heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing them inside the cavernous, humming chamber of pure plasma containment. Behind reinforced observation glass that was 3 feet thick, Envoy Tyrus stood shoulder to shoulder with the Academy's Supreme Council, their faces bathed in the harsh clinical light of the control room. "Activate the echo emitter," Tyrus commanded. His voice broadcasted coldly through the core's internal speakers. "We need to establish the creature's loyalty threshold. If the human breaks under pressure, we will finally see if the beast defends its handler or consumes him." The echo emitter was an illegal, highly classified psychological interrogation device designed to violently bypass organic mental defenses. It forced a subject to vividly relive their absolute greatest terror by stimulating the deepest panic centers of the brain. It was, by all definitions, a torture machine. The operatives powered the device to maximum capacity. A blinding, invisible wave of concentrated neural resonance blasted into the energy core, striking Calvin directly in the chest. The Alliance tacticians waited eagerly for the human to collapse into a screaming, hyperventilating mess on the metal deck. They waited for the heavy scent of fresh panic to drive the dark matter entity into a feeding frenzy. But they had profoundly miscalculated the nature of the abyss. The psychic frequency slammed into the unyielding fortress of Calvin's mind and found absolutely nothing to amplify. There was no trauma left to exploit, no hidden fear to magnify. The wave ricocheted off his emotional black hole and violently bounced outward, refracting directly into the shifting crystalline structure of the Null Wraith. The forced neural assault did not break Calvin. Instead, it inadvertently acted as a violent catalyst, bridging the final biological gap between the two entities. The boy and the beast achieved total, catastrophic synchronization. In a fraction of a second, Calvin felt the cold, crushing gravity of a dying star. Simultaneously, the Null Wraith felt the boundless, infinitely quiet void of dead space-time. They became a singular, unified consciousness, sensing the hostile intrusion into the only sanctuary it possessed. The Null Wraith did not panic. It became utterly, righteously enraged. Its core detonated from a soothing blue into a blinding, apocalyptic white. The beast reared back and unleashed a massive, concentrated electromagnetic pulse that defied every known law of localized thermodynamics. The shockwave shattered the 3-foot-thick observation glass into millions of flying razors. The echo emitter violently short-circuited in a massive shower of molten slag. But the catastrophic damage did not stop there. The immense pulse surged aggressively through the primary power grid, instantly blinding the station's central artificial intelligence and completely knocking out the localized anti-gravity navigation systems. The sickening, terrifying groan of twisting structural metal echoed through the entire superstructure. Without its orbital tether, the colossal mass of the Ethelgard Topographical Engineering Academy surrendered to the crushing gravitational pull of the gas giant below. The station violently tilted on its axis, throwing everything into absolute chaos. In the observation deck, Envoy Tyrus and the elite council members were thrown brutally to the angled floor, their pristine robes tearing on shattered glass. Blaring crimson warning lights bathed the collapsing corridors in the color of fresh blood. The deafening, mechanical shriek of the station breaching the upper layers of the turbulent, highly acidic atmosphere drowned out the panicked screams of the elite student body. Warning! The backup automated system droned coldly over the emergency speakers. Orbital decay is at critical status. Structural integrity heavily compromised. Evacuation protocols initiated. System error. Escape pod launch rails are jammed. Total atmospheric immolation in exactly 4 minutes. Thousands of lives. Beings who considered themselves the absolute pinnacle of biological and academic evolution were suddenly thrust into a chaotic freefall toward an agonizing, melting death. Panic, raw and unfiltered, flooded every deck of the entire station. In the ruined observation room, Envoy Tyrus dragged his bleeding, battered body toward the shattered window. His unshakable military arrogance was entirely crushed under the sheer, unimaginable weight of his own fatal mistake. He looked down into the energy core. Amidst the flying sparks and the failing lights, Calvin Blankenship stood perfectly upright on the violently tilted floor. The blazing white entity coiled protectively around him like a shield of pure starfire. "Save us," Tyrus begged, his voice cracking, completely abandoning his pride and authority as the floor plates shook violently beneath him. "Blankenship, please. We cannot stop the descent. We are all going to burn. You have to save us." The exterior hull of Ethelgard began to blister and peel away as the station plunged deeper into the gravity well. The friction against the dense, violent atmosphere of the gas giant acted like a cosmic grinding wheel, tearing strips of heavy alloy from the superstructure. Inside the energy core, the ambient temperature spiked instantly. The air tasted heavily of burning copper and melting polymers. The emergency sirens screamed, but they were barely a whisper against the deafening roar of impending atmospheric immolation. Calvin Blankenship completely ignored the desperate, pathetic pleas of Envoy Tyrus. He turned his gaze away from the shattered observation deck and looked directly at the breached containment seal of the primary nuclear fusion reactor. The safety locks had violently failed. The heavy blast shielding was warped, and the core was venting raw, unshielded plasma. To step into that chamber was an act of pure madness. It meant embracing immediate, agonizing atomic disassembly. The temperatures inside could instantly reduce any known biological matter to ash. Without a single moment of hesitation, Calvin walked forward. The Null Wraith sensed his impossible intent. The beast unleashed a tremendous, structural shattering roar, but it was no longer a cry of predatory hunger or territorial threat. It was a fierce, desperate declaration of absolute protection. As Calvin crossed the ruined threshold into the blinding, white-hot inferno of the reactor, the entity lunged. It did not strike. Instead, it threw its massive body over the fragile human, violently breaking apart its own shifting crystalline structure. The dark matter and blue energy wrapped around Calvin like a second skin, forming an absolute, impenetrable armor of pure cosmic energy. Inside the raging heart of the nuclear fire, the boy and the nightmare achieved the ultimate synthesis. The Null Wraith possessed infinite, chaotic power, a boundless ocean of energy harvested from the event horizons of collapsed stars. Calvin possessed the silent, unbreakable void, a mind forged in the crushing emptiness of dead space-time. Together, they catalyzed a physical miracle, using the absolute stillness of his mind to anchor the beast's erratic power. Calvin forced the escaping plasma and the dark matter to fold inward. He collapsed the energy into a highly localized, fiercely controlled artificial singularity. Calvin closed his gray eyes. In that blinding moment, he ceased to be merely a human intern. He transformed his own brain into the ultimate central processing unit. He channeled the agonizingly massive output of the captive singularity, coldly calculating vector trajectories, atmospheric drag, and gravitational resistance in the absolute silence of his mind. He forced the raw, unyielding power of the beast down through the station's dead power conduits, violently bypassing the fried circuits, and slammed the energy directly into the primary magnetic thruster arrays. The result was apocalyptic in its majesty. A colossal, blinding shockwave of pure cerulean light erupted from the belly of the plunging academy. The explosion of blue energy swept across the upper atmosphere of the entire planet, instantly vaporizing the violent, swirling storm clouds for hundreds of miles. The massive orbital structure, weighing millions of tons, was violently yanked upward against the crushing gravity of the gas giant. The metal groaned in agony. The bulkhead screamed under the sudden shift in momentum, but the deadly descent halted. The Ethelgard Topographical Engineering Academy leveled out, hovering in perfect, stable equilibrium just inches above the deadly, swirling acidic clouds. Thousands of lives, moments away from being burned into nothingness, were dragged back from the brink of absolute destruction. Back in the devastated control room, the emergency sirens finally choked and died. Envoy Tyrus and the surviving members of the Supreme Council pulled themselves off the slanted floor, staring in terrified awe at the reactor chamber. The twisted, melted doors of the core groaned apart. Thick white steam poured heavily out into the corridor. Out of the smoke stepped Calvin Blankenship. His standard-issue uniform was completely intact. He did not have a single burn, not a single scratch upon his skin, not a single hair out of place. Behind him, the towering, terrifying nightmare of the cosmos did not loom over the room. Instead, the null wraith rapidly compressed its immense mass, shrinking down until it merged seamlessly into the dark outline cast by Calvin's standard boots. It had willingly abandoned its physical dominance to become a permanent, symbiotic shadow, bound to the quiet human. The silence that fell over the station was absolute. It was heavier than the gravity of the planet below. No towering Kalen dared to breathe loudly. No dense Verati dared to click its scales. Envoy Tyrus fell heavily to his knees, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the boy he had tried to break. Within one standard hour, the Alliance High Command scrambled all encrypted channels to issue a galaxy-wide emergency directive. Every single psychological, physical, and combat test regarding the human was immediately and permanently revoked. The highest military authority in the known universe officially classified Calvin Blankenship and his living shadow under a newly created, unprecedented designation Omega Threat. They were never to be engaged. They were never to be tested. They were never to be given a single order. They were completely, terrifyingly untouchable. Calvin did not wait for their polished medals, their stammering apologies, or their trembling speeches of gratitude. He simply turned his back on the highest authorities of the known universe. He walked steadily through the ruined corridors, his dark, living shadow trailing perfectly behind him, and boarded the first deep space expedition vessel, preparing to leave the Academy docking bay. He did not utter a single word of farewell. He simply left, leaving behind a vastly superior, arrogant alien empire that was forced to bow in absolute, trembling reverence before the devastating silence of a single human being. Thank you so deeply for listening to our story today. We would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? If you enjoyed this journey across the stars, please consider supporting our team with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or by using the donation link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your incredible kindness helps us pay our hard-working crew so they can feed their families and keep creating better, more epic stories for you. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next adventure.